We spend a lot of time talking about the nervous system as a major regulatory system in our body, and you've also learned this week how important the endocrine system is for regulating our body activities as well. If we think about the difference between these two systems, we can remember that the nervous system is going to signal activities to happen electrically. So through action potentials, through action potentials down a neuron, we're going to send information through neurotransmitters onto other cells. And then the endocrine system is going to do this hormonally. So there are going to be hormones, which are chemicals secreted into the bloodstream that then trigger effects throughout the body. Now, one particular thing that we need to talk about before we get all the way into this system has to do with the regulation that happens here at this junction between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is certainly a part of the brain. So this is actually a part of the nervous system. The pituitary gland actually has two different components. Part of it is going to be neural in nature, meaning it's part of the nervous system, and part of the pituitary gland is actually simply glandular or endocrine in nature. So let me change my pen color here so I can get away from the red and the blue for just a second, and I need to show you something. So we know that the brain is composed of neurons. You can see all the cell bodies up here, right? Neurons have a cell body, and then their long axon, and then axon terminals where neurotransmitters are secreted, right? We know that part from what we went through last week. Well, the hypothalamus has two sets of neurons. It has some neurons that actually send their axons down into this posterior pituitary gland. That means that the posterior pituitary gland is actually simply going to be neural in nature. So the posterior is neural. It is not composed of glandular tissue, but simply a collection of axon terminals that come from neurons up higher in the hypothalamus. So that when an action potential travels down this particular axon to its axon terminals, then you're going to get the release of hormones from those axon terminals into a system of blood vessels here in the pituitary gland that then make their way out into the body. So the posterior pituitary gland is neural. It is simply a concentrated group of axon terminals where these hormones are going to be released. They're really neurotransmitters that get released directly into the bloodstream. And the posterior pituitary gland is only responsible for producing oxytocin and ADH. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these hormones, oxytocin and ADH, are actually being produced up in the hypothalamus at the cell body of these neurons. The axon terminals are simply housing and storing those hormones until the action potential travels down and tells them to be released. So oxytocin and ADH are the only ones that are secreted here by the posterior pituitary gland. Now we can move over to the anterior pituitary gland, and this is going to be a very different story. The anterior pituitary gland is actually going to be glandular in nature, so it's really going to look like a bunch of epithelial cells because that's mostly what your glands are made of. So this is a cluster of glandular tissue, and these blood vessels are simply sitting on top of those cells because they're ready to release hormones also from the hypothalamus. But let's take a look at what those are. So in the anterior pituitary gland, you do have your cell bodies of your neurons up here in the hypothalamus, but you can think of them as having little short axons and short axon terminal branches. These hormones that come from the hypothalamus are your releasing and inhibiting hormones. So those are the major controlling hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus. What they do is that they secrete their hormones into this vascular system right here. Okay, so they get released into that vascular system, and then they are going to travel through that small set of capillaries onto the actual glandular tissue of the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the interesting thing is that these releasing and inhibitory hormones are actually very specific. So there will only be some specific cells within the anterior pituitary gland that will have a receptor for a particular releasing or inhibitory hormone. As these other chemicals or hormones get released, if there's no receptor on one of these cells, then it does nothing. It can't activate anything within that cell. So here's an example. Let's say that we have, from the hypothalamus, we get growth hormone releasing hormone secreted, right? It travels down this little vascular system that we see here, and it's going to bind to the particular cells of the anterior pituitary that can secrete growth hormone, okay? So they have to have an actual receptor on them in order to bind to the growth hormone releasing hormone, right? And then it will make those cells secrete the growth hormone into the bloodstream, and that then flows into the body. You also have another type of option here called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. It would come in and inhibit these growth hormone cells from secreting growth hormone. But if you get a hormone called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, it's not going to be able to do anything to these cells because they don't have a receptor for TRH. But another set of cells here in the anterior pituitary may have the exact receptor for TRH, and that's going to cause TSH to be secreted. So even the cells in the anterior pituitary gland have to have specific receptors in order to respond to that hormone, just like all of the target cells found elsewhere in the body have to have specific receptors for their hormone.